I'm Phil Harling. I'm the director of the Center for the Humanities, and it's great to see you guys all here this evening for the second in our book talk series for the academic year. We typically do about one each month during the year, so I believe our full schedule is out. If you take a look at one of those flyers, check us out, see what else we're going to be offering. Come on back and see us again. But without any further ado, I wanted to introduce to you the other UM faculty member who's going to introduce our main event, our main speaker tonight. And so I'm here to introduce Costa Pesqueda, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at UM. He's been here since 2015. Costa's research interests cover a broad range of topics at the intersection between international relations, security studies, and comparative politics. He's the author of many articles in journals ranging from international security to the Journal of Peace Research. A couple of years ago, he published a book with Columbia University Press, 2020, Conflict Among Rebels, Why Insurgent Groups Fight Each Other, and he was just telling me he's got another book coming out reasonably soon, so in a year or two, Costa will be giving his book talk, but in the meantime, I want to call into the lectern to introduce Brian. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello everyone, thank you very much. I know some of you, most of you, it's good to still face the new ones. Thank you very much for the Center for Humanities for organizing the event, and thanks to Brian for inviting me. So I'll be very brief. I met Brian when he was a first year PhD student, I guess, because, and then we, in the second year doing our PhD at Columbia University, we taught together a class called War, Peace and Strategy. That's where I think both of us learned quite a bit about these issues, and Brian has kept learning and then producing excellent research on these topics. He has studied and then worked in some of the best places where the discipline of political science and international relations are forged on a daily basis. He has been a nuclear fellow, a Stanton nuclear fellow at the Council for Foreign Relations. He has been a postdoc at the Dickey Center for International Understanding, is that correct? At Dartmouth, and of course, he has been a great professor here at the University of Miami. He is an expert on a range of issues related to international relations and international security. He's one of the biggest names already on issues related to the internal dynamics of alliances, and the book that he's going to present today on burden sharing is an example of this kind of influential research that we've been doing, but he also has been contributing, as I said, to a range of security and international relations issues, such as international basings and bases. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Brian. I'm looking forward to hearing about this. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Costa. Thank you, Phil. Big thanks to the Center for the Humanities and to Books and Books for hosting this. I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you all for coming out. So today, I'm going to be saying a little bit about my recent book, The Burden Sharing Dilemma, Coercive Diplomacy in U.S. Alliance Politics, which was published last year by Cornell University Press. And now, the sort of motivation for this book is that issues of burden sharing in alliances are some of the most important and also some of the most contentious in alliances. Burden sharing, when it comes to alliances, burden sharing really is kind of where the work gets done, right? Burden sharing is how alliances achieve their objectives, right? Burden sharing is the process by which countries in alliances pool resources for the purposes of achieving common objectives, which can range from winning wars to deterring adversaries. And the reason that burden sharing is so important is that burden sharing is the mechanism by which the members of that alliance produce the resources they need without unduly straining the resources or the patience of any one member. Without burden sharing, you either risk the alliance failing to achieve its objective if they don't produce enough, or you risk alienating certain partners that are over-contributing, unduly straining their resources in a way that taxes them and causes them to decline. Burden sharing, when it comes to alliances, few issues are as important as burden sharing. Okay, there we go. Now, in part because burden sharing is so important, it is often among the most contentious and among the issues that can cause the most friction and resentment in alliances. We've seen this recently, in particular with the candidacy and presidency of Donald Trump, who really made burden sharing one of the core issues in his foreign policy agenda, going as far to say that he might be unwilling to defend U.S. allies that hadn't paid their fair share. But in a lot of ways, Trump is really just the most recent manifestation of a much longer practice, which is the kind of use of both the deep concern for burden sharing and also the use of often coercive tactics for the purposes of pursuing burden sharing. In many ways, what really distinguished Trump was not so much the sort of content of his approach oftentimes, it was oftentimes instead more of a stylistic difference, which is to say that Trump was often willing to have these disputes in public in a way that other presidents preferred to have them private. Now, despite burden sharing's importance, despite the importance with which policymakers place on it, if you look at the academic literature on burden sharing, the picture you get is one of pretty profound pessimism. In general, conventional wisdom on alliance burden sharing is that it's really, really hard, particularly in U.S. alliances, to actually achieve something approaching an equitable distribution of burdens. And the reasons for this, there's a few. And some of these are unique to U.S. alliances, which is why I focus on them. The first issue is simply that the U.S. is just so much larger than its allies. Most U.S. allies are a fraction the size of the U.S. population, the size of the economy, and especially in terms of the size of their militaries. And that means a couple things. One, it means that the U.S.'s contributions matter more. Right? When it comes to achieving common objectives, the U.S. really kind of often can go it alone if it really wants to, right? So the U.S.'s contributions have the potential to be really, really decisive to the outcome of any conflict involving the alliance, whereas you can't say the same for most other allies, some more than others, but in general, much, much less so than the U.S. Making matters even worse for the U.S. is that oftentimes these alliances are kind of asymmetric by design, which is to say that a lot of U.S. alliances are structured in a way that either that they explicitly are asymmetric, which is to say that the U.S. is pledged to defend allies, but allies aren't pledged to defend the U.S. This is the case for Japan, whose mutual defense treaty with the U.S. does not require Japan to help the U.S., but does require the opposite. But even beyond just the content of treaties, the U.S. alliances are often asymmetric in the sense that the U.S. provides security in these alliances and in exchange gets other things. Those could be military bases, it could be votes in the UN, it could be favorable trade agreements. It could just, oftentimes, really just kind of a commitment to kind of uphold U.S. foreign policy, right? To be a reliable U.S. partner. So that's one set of issues. The other set of issues is that the U.S. does a lot to signal that it is willing and able to defend allies. This can take a variety of different forms, but the main one is the U.S. troop presence abroad. Right? The United States stations hundreds of thousands of troops abroad, less so today than during the Cold War, but still quite a lot today. And what that troop presence does is it effectively shows allies and adversaries that the U.S. is committed to allies' defense and increases the perceived likelihood that the U.S. will actually be there for allies if they're attacked, which is good if you're trying to deter adversaries, but maybe not so good if what you want is to encourage allies to spend more, right? Because if allies know that you'll be there for them, maybe they have less incentive to contribute themselves, right? So that's the basic landscape of the problem. But there's some issues if you look at burden sharing through this very pessimistic lens, right? Because there's a lot of cases that just don't quite work if you approach burden sharing through the lens that burden sharing is always really tough because the U.S. is just too big, allies are too small, and allies host too many U.S. forces. A lot of countries spend way more on defense than you might expect based on those factors. Right? So take West Germany during the Cold War. Right? West Germany hosted something like 250,000 U.S. forces. Should be an unlikely candidate for spending a lot on defense. Right? If you sort of assume that troops mean you spend less, well, West Germany was the biggest contributor in NATO after the U.S. Right? West Germany spent upwards of 4% of its GDP on defense most years. Right? It was a really, really outsized contributor. Likewise, today, you see a similar dynamic in Eastern Europe. The Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, right? These countries spend a lot on defense, right? Relative to their size, right? They're much smaller than the US, but relative to their size, they spend a whole lot. There's also cases where, and notably, these countries are really small, right? So if you take the sort of free-riding logic that small allies free ride, right? Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania should be spending almost nothing, right? Because what do their contributions matter? But there's also cases of allies that you might have expected to be big contributors who often didn't come through when it counted. France was one such example. France was one of the largest members of NATO. After the U.S., it was kind of in the next tier below with Germany and Britain. And yet France was a perpetual kind of thorn in NATO's side when it came to issues of burden sharing. France went as far as to actually withdraw its military from NATO command in 1966. Right? So France was not a model contributor, which one might have expected it to be, given that France is reasonably big. There's a third category of cases where, in some ways, these are the most puzzling cases of all. Cases where you might have expected the U.S. to be really quite interested in encouraging allies to spend more on defense, and become more self-reliant, but it actually wasn't. And in many cases still hasn't been to this day. Starting in the 1990s, really since the 1990s, the U.S. has been often pretty skeptical of European Union defense initiatives. Right? It has, Madeleine Albright called this the 3 Ds of European defense. And it was that Europe should not duplicate NATO, it should not decouple from NATO, and its military procurement should not discriminate against non-European producers. Right? The U.S. was actually very, very concerned about European Union defense initiatives. It was worried that Europe could actually become too self-reliant. So, this book is an attempt to try and essentially reconcile a lot of these anomalous cases, right? To try and present a theory that can explain both why and when the U.S. encourages allies to become more self-reliant, and when it does, when its efforts succeed or fail. And the argument that I make in the book centers around what I call the burden-sharing dilemma. And this dilemma has basically two related components, and together I refer to as the burden-sharing dilemma. The first challenge is the one I alluded to at the top. Right? This is sort of conventional wisdom's challenge, which is that the very tools that the U.S. uses to reassure its allies, to deter adversaries, right? So things like stationing troops abroad, things like making public declarations that the U.S. wants to defend allies, right? All the things that the U.S. does to kind of make allies feel reassured and to deter adversaries, that might have the perverse effect of in turn reducing allies' desire to invest in defense. What I argue is that this challenge is often actually overstated, right? That the U.S. is often able to surmount this challenge through what I refer to as conditional pressure, right? Which is to say that the U.S. is often willing and able to, even among allies that receive a lot of assurances of protection, even among allies that host a lot of troops, the U.S. says repeatedly that it will defend them, the U.S. is often able to get those allies to contribute more by essentially combining those assurances of support with threats that those might be withheld unless allies contribute. Right? So take troop levies. Oftentimes, a tried and true tactic for the U.S. when it comes to encouraging burden sharing is to essentially say, you host all these troops, we are thinking about withdrawing them, but we won't if you boost your defense spending by XYZ. That often works. It doesn't always work. I'll talk more in a moment about the conditions under which it's likely to work. But it's a pretty common, often effective tactic. And the reason it's effective is that no matter how much the U.S. reassures allies, there's always some degree of doubt in allies' minds about how long the U.S. will be there, about the probability the U.S. will actually defend them, right? And if you're a country like, say, Poland today, even if the U.S. does defend you, right, you're still in a pretty vulnerable spot, right? It still behooves you to do a lot for yourself. So the U.S. is often surprisingly able to encourage burden sharing, even among allies that host a lot of U.S. troops, for example. The other challenge is one that the existing literature tends to overlook, right? And this is in many ways the much more fundamental problem. And the second problem that the U.S. faces is that the very act of investing in self-defense, the very act of becoming self-reliant, actually empowers allies to essentially resist U.S. influence, right? Which is to say that allies who are more capable of defending themselves are also more capable of telling the U.S. no, right? And that's a trade-off, right? That is a basic trade-off that the U.S. has in some cases been unwilling to accept, and has, as a result, been less willing to encourage allies to invest in defense than it might have been otherwise. And so what the U.S. does to accommodate this is it encourages burden sharing very selectively. Right? It's very attuned to on the one hand, the benefits of burden sharing, right, versus the downside that allies will become more capable of doing their own thing, going their own way, telling the U.S. no. So, taken all together, the U.S. is more likely to encourage burden sharing when, on the one hand, the need for burden sharing outweighs the risk that allies will become more independent. Right? So that's the kind of, for the U.S., that's the crucial calculus. Does the U.S.'s need for contributions and the need to conserve its own resources outweigh the downside of allies becoming more capable of telling the US no. For the Allies' calculus, what matters is, do they fear being abandoned, right? Which is to say, how confident are they that the US will actually defend them, and to what extent can the US kind of use that fear to in turn encourage them to burden share? And that fear has two components, right? There's both the likelihood the US will abandon them, but also the consequences of being abandoned, right? So, and those two things are distinct, right? You can imagine an ally that has a very high estimation that they might be abandoned, but maybe the consequences of being abandoned aren't too bad. Or the opposite, right? You might imagine an ally that is pretty confident the US will defend them, but they are, they're still really, really worried about being abandoned. So, a couple basic. I'm going to go through a couple kind of simple predictions that I explore in the book. First prediction is that the US is more likely to encourage burden sharing among allies that are kind of medium-sized, right? So this little figure here, so on the x-axis here you have, this is allies' latent military power. And latent military power, what I mean by that is the resources that an ally could convert into military power. So you're thinking here like wealth, population, right? If an ally wanted to, how much could it bring to bear? You might expect this graph to look something like this, like a straight upward line. But what I argue in the book is that actually the US is most likely to encourage burden sharing among allies kind of in this middle range, right? Because those allies are simultaneously large enough to make a difference if they contribute, right? Whereas allies over here, their contributions don't really matter very much if you're tiny, right? If you're Luxembourg, if you're Iceland, right? It doesn't really matter if you contribute that much, right? You're just too small to make a difference. But if you're all the way out here, right? If you're really, really large, then your contributions, your latent military power makes it such that if you contribute more, you actually maybe could tell the US no, right? And that's kind of the position that the European Union is in, that Japan has historically been in, and so the US has historically been pretty circumspect about asking these guys out here to actually invest more. So, second basic prediction is that the greater the threat environment, the more burden sharing you're likely to see. Right? This one's more straightforward. You might expect, for example, that when there is a really compelling external threat, the U.S. might be willing to kind of try to bite the bullet and encourage burden sharing, even when it might be concerned about the risk that allies will become more independent. Now, does that necessarily mean that you're going to get burden sharing? Well, not necessarily. There's a bit of a challenge here because threat kind of cuts in opposite directions. Right? The threat environment's really bad. An ally, yes, might be more likely to burden share because they need protection more. But if the threat environment's really bad, then the U.S. might in turn be less likely to abandon allies, right? It needs allies more when its perception of threat is really severe. So, the challenge is that those two things are correlated, right? An ally's perception of threat, U.S. perception of threat, likely to kind of cut in opposite directions. So, how do you separate these two things, right? What I do in the book is I essentially say, well, one way to do it is focus on geography, right? Geography is constant across the US, but it varies among allies. And the basic hypothesis in the book is that allies bordering a shared adversary by land will be more susceptible to US pressure, right? So that's, today you're Poland, in the Cold War, you're West Germany, you're South Korea. And finally, the kind of third prediction that the book tests is that when U.S. resources are constrained, right, which is to say, when the economy is in bad shape, when the U.S. is kind of occupied in foreign wars, the U.S. is going to be more likely to encourage burden sharing because it needs contributions, right? It can't do it all by itself. As I'll talk about in the case studies, this was the story of the U.S. during the late 1960s, early 1970s, during the kind of peak of the Vietnam War. The U.S. really leaned on its allies, was often quite successful in doing so. So, to test these kind of basic predictions, what I do is I explore 4 cases in the book. Not going to get to all 4 in the talk today. Just going to get to 1 or 2. But I pick cases that basically kind of fill out different values of the main independent variables. Right? So there's some countries that are really large, some countries that are really small, some countries in between, some countries where the threat environment is really severe, some countries where it's less severe. I try to pick a mix. And the 2 cases I'm going to talk about today are South Korea and Japan. I picked them because, for a couple of reasons, for the purposes of the talk today. One is that they're right next to each other, so you kind of, same region, kind of same overarching threat environment, but they differ in 2 crucial respects. The first is that South Korea, its threat environment was much more dangerous because it bordered North Korea, whereas Japan was separated from the mainland by water. The other big difference is that Japan was enormous, still is enormous, whereas South Korea was much smaller, much weaker. And so what I expect to see in those 2 cases is a couple things. The first is that the U.S. will lean very hard on South Korea to contribute more, less so on Japan. And second, that Japan will be much less susceptible to whatever U.S. pressure it does face compared to South Korea. And I compare these 2 cases over the same time period, the 1960s to the 1970s, to show kind of how the U.S. approach to burden sharing changed over time as a result of the war in Vietnam. So, I want to talk first about Japan. Japan, in many ways, is the crucial case in the book. Because Japan is a case where it's kind of like one of the most outlier cases when it comes to just how potentially powerful Japan was, right? Japan, by 1970, Japan was the 2nd largest economy in the world. Its economy was growing very rapidly. And there was some hope that perhaps Japan could take over a lot of the U.S. responsibility in East Asia, right? That the U.S. could essentially lean on Japan to become more capable, become more self-reliant, and the U.S. could kind of draw down from East Asia. That didn't happen for a variety of reasons. The big reason from the U.S. perspective is that it started to get cold feet about what a truly self-reliant Japan might mean. Right? The U.S. during the 1960s was beginning to look at Japan as a potential contributor, but it ultimately recoiled from really leaning on Japan because it feared a few things. One is that it feared that, in the most general sense, that a more self-reliant Japan might not necessarily be a reliable partner, that it might do things like strike a bargain with the People's Republic of China, with the Soviet Union, and essentially become a neutral in the Cold War. The other big concern is that Japan might nuclearize, that it might pursue nuclear weapons, and more concretely, there was a concern that Japan might basically kind of move out of the U.S. orbit, right? That Japan might evict the U.S. from its bases in Japan, that Japan might essentially tell the U.S. that it wasn't going to follow it around anymore. And so what we ended up seeing in the 1960s was a pretty light hand The U.S. didn't really lean on Japan that much, even though there was a ton of discussion internally about doing so. There was a pretty extensive internal debate within the National Security Council, the State Department, Defense Department, about the possibility of leaning on Japan. And they ultimately decided not to. That looked like it might change in the next decade, in the 1970s, for one key reason. The key reason, well, two key reasons. The first reason was Vietnam, and the second reason was the effect the Vietnam War was having in the U.S. Vietnam War, it sapped U.S. strength very in a direct way in terms of occupying a lot of manpower, a lot of resources that U.S. could have used elsewhere in East Asia, and for that matter in Europe. It also sapped its political will. Right? The sort of backlash to the Vietnam War in the U.S. really put a lot of pressure on the Johnson and then Nixon administrations to not only draw down the war, but to kind of take a more restrained role in the world. In Europe, this took the form of efforts to withdraw U.S. troops from Europe. In Asia, it took the form of what became known as the Guam Doctrine, which was named after this speech that Nixon gave on the island of Guam, later became known as the Nixon Doctrine. Basically, the idea of the doctrine was that the U.S. would look more to allies to shoulder the burden for their own self-defense. Right? The U.S. would essentially look to allies as the first line of defense. And if they couldn't take care of it, well, maybe the U.S. would step in. Given that, you might have expected the U.S. would do that, right? That the U.S. and it might especially do that in the case of Japan, because if the name of the game was let allies take care of themselves, well, no better ally to do that than Japan. And yet, the same set of considerations that prevented the U.S. from really leaning more on Japan in the 1960s, again, more or less prevailed in the 1970s too. For, again, similar reasons, that the U.S. was just really concerned that a self-reliant Japan might not be a reliable ally. Again, there was extensive discussion in the U.S. government on this point. Oftentimes, like very from a research perspective, often very usefully, very blunt. There's this passage that I quoted up here by Henry Kissinger, where he's kind of summarizing the discussion of one of these meetings, and he basically sits down and says, "Well, okay, what do we want from Japan? Right? We want bases. We want Japan to contribute more. We want Japan to remain non-nuclear. We want Japan to remain a close U.S. partner. And so we want all these things from Japan. And if we can get them all, great. But can we really get them all?" And then eventually, what they came down on was no, that they couldn't have it all in the case of Japan. And so what you saw again was this kind of very kind of lukewarm approach to Japanese burden sharing. The kind of U.S. line repeatedly was that they wanted moderate qualitative improvements in Japanese defense capabilities. And there was some movement in Japan, but it wouldn't be until later that the Japanese defense spending really took off. Yeah, and just to kind of give you a sense of Japanese military spending over the course of the 1960s and 70s, really quite flat. The dotted line is the one to really care about here, which is Japanese defense spending proportionate to GDP. Basically hovers around the same kind of 0.8 to 1.2 mark, basically from 1960 to 1980, right? Not a ton of movement. And that's very much the opposite of what was the case in South Korea. South Korea presented a very different set of incentives for the U.S. South Korea was much smaller than Japan, but it was, like Japan, growing very quickly. It was very, very rapidly approaching a position from the US perspective in which South Korea might be able to handle itself vis-a-vis North Korea. And so the US leaned on South Korea quite a bit, particularly during the 1970s. What the US wanted most from South Korea was help in the Vietnam War, and it got it. South Korea contributed a lot of forces in South Vietnam. It was after the US, the largest contributor to the war. Tens and thousands of South Koreans fought in South Vietnam. The U.S. often defrayed their costs, but as South Korea was becoming richer, the U.S. was increasingly looking to South Korea to assume the burden for defending itself. And that very much culminated in the 1970s. In the 1970s, the U.S., again, in part because of the Guam Doctrine, really leaned very, very hard on South Korea to spend more on defense. And its efforts to do so were really quite coercive, quite blunt. Nixon, Ford, and Carter all used the threat of troop withdrawals to really put the screws on South Korea, get it to spend more on defense. And they got it. South Korean defense spending absolutely skyrocketed over the course of the 1970s. Meanwhile, U.S. military aid to South Korea plummeted. By 1980, South Korea was basically shouldering the bulk of its own defense capability. Right? Whereas 20 years prior, the U.S. was furnishing about 90% of the South Korean defense budget. That ratio was inversed, it was inverted and approaching zero by 1980. And you can really, if you just look at the trends in South Korean defense spending on the left here, like it really just absolutely takes off. Kind of gradually growing over the course of the 1960s, and then right around the early 1970s, just absolutely just goes wild. And the same is true as a percentage of GDP, which in many ways is much more important, right? South Korea goes from spending about 1% of GDP on defense for most of the time period to, by 1980s, spending basically 4%. And it's 4% of a much larger GDP than it had previously, right? So very, very different story than you had in the case of Japan. And you see the opposite trend when it comes to U.S. military aid, right? U.S. military aid to South Korea was really, really high in 1960. Had kind of a brief uptick around 1970, and then by 1980, it's basically down to nothing. Right? So South Korea, by 1980, the U.S. is really, really looking to it to spend more on defense, and is very, very successful in doing so. So, to wrap up, I think there's a few kind of big picture implications one can take from this. I think the main one is that, look, the U.S.'s ability to actually encourage allies to spend more on defense is constrained, right? The takeaway from the book is not that the U.S. has unlimited leverage to encourage allies to become more self-reliant. But the main constraints that it faces are not the ones that you typically see in kind of existing work on the subject, right? It's not the case that the U.S. is kind of helpless to encourage burden sharing among allies that are either small or that host a lot of U.S. troops, right? That's not the case. Instead, the kind of primary barriers the U.S. faces to encouraging burden sharing are in part structural, right? A lot of them stem from just where the ally is, its geography, right? And that's something the U.S. can't change, right? The U.S. can't make Germany and Poland switch positions. Right? Maybe it would like to. Germany's much larger than Poland, and it would be. There are a lot of folks in the U.S. who would love for Germany to be spending as much on defense as Poland is today, proportionately. But it just, it can't snap its fingers and make that happen. That's a very structural constraint. The other big constraint on the U.S.'s ability to get allies to spend more on defense is often just kind of its own priorities, right? Oftentimes when you look at an ally and see that it's not spending as much as you might expect it to, oftentimes that's kind of with U.S., maybe not quite endorsement, but kind of tacit approval, right? Japan spent 1% of GDP on defense, really, and still does spend close to 1%, though it's gone up a lot the last couple of years. And, that's partly driven by Japan's calculus, but something the U.S. has been willing to live with for a long time, in part because it has just been worried about what a self-reliant Japan would mean for U.S. foreign policy. And it was willing to accept a Japan that underspent because that, in its mind, that meant a loyal, reliable Japan. It was willing to sacrifice some Japanese defense spending for that broader goal. And so oftentimes, the constraint on allies' burden sharing isn't so much allies' willingness to burden share, though that is also important, but oftentimes it's actually the U.S. willingness itself to encourage it. So when you see burden sharing outcome out in the wild, I think that the kind of central takeaway is that tango in some sense takes two. So with that, I will wrap things up, and I think we can move to Q&A. So thanks.
I'm just going to grab this mic here, and we'll throw it up into questions, and this way everybody can hear each other. Questions? Right.
Dr. Blankenship, one of the, during the Trump administration, when burden sharing came up, it seemed to be, I would say, confused with buying weapons from the United States. So, to what extent are these the same thing? Just, you should carry more of the burden mean you should buy more weapons from U.S. weapons manufacturers, or are they distinct?
They're related in a sense, but in another sense, they're not only distinct, they in some sense point in opposite directions. Thank you. Part of if the U.S. The U.S. often kind of wants to have its cake and eat it too, right? It wants allies to arm themselves, to become more self-reliant, so the U.S. can do less, they can do more. And it wants them to do it using weapons made in the U.S. And if the U.S. can get that, then great, that's great for the U.S. But the challenge in doing that is that the more self-reliant allies become, the more they're going to want to kind of see the fruits of that self-reliance come domestically, right? And they're going to want to build up their own defense industries to kind of reap those rewards instead of just buying it from abroad and letting all that money go to Boeing or Lockheed. And that's been a central point of contention. It's one of the reasons why the U.S., particularly in the case of Europe, has burden sharing. On the one hand, it perpetually complains about European free riding, but when Europe starts to actually come up with some kind of proposal to move towards self-reliance, oftentimes that includes things like joint procurement programs, and the U.S. says, "Whoa, hold on, not like that," And so there's this kind of perpetual cycle of U.S. desire for burden sharing, European proposal for burden sharing. The U.S. kind of backs off and tries to tinker around the edges with this proposal, and you kind of end up with the status quo. And it's like almost like every 10 years or so you get a new round of this. You had it in the 90s, right after the end of the Cold War. You again had it in the late 2000s, and you had it again with the during Trump administration, and even to some extent now. I think that one of the unanswered questions of the Biden administration and beyond is, is the U.S. actually willing to let Europe take the reins? Historically, it's always kind of seemed like it, in principle, wants them to, but then when it actually is confronted with that, it says, no, don't worry, like we're not going to leave. And so it ends up being very cyclical. But the two things often do go. They're often in tension rather than being complementary, though they're often thought of as complementary.
Today, South Korea has latent military power that's quite similar to Japan. And although the geopolitical threat hasn't changed, it's still hot compared to Japan. So the difference in approach is essentially because today is just because of the difference in geopolitical threat level. Is that correct in your analysis?
I think that's largely correct. I think what you've seen in Asia the last 5 years or so from the U.S. is, you've seen an increasing kind of pivot toward kind of emphasizing great power competition with China, and that has to some extent been accompanied by an increased willingness to kind of lean more on allies. Now, it's not, it's sort of hard to know without knowing what's going on within the administrations, both Trump and Biden. But in the case of Japan and South Korea as well, both of them are making pretty substantial investments in defense, renewed over the past few years, especially Japan, in accordance with, it has a new national defense strategy. And from everything I've seen, there hasn't been like any sort of backlash from the U.S., right? Like it hasn't, there's still the kind of residual concerns about kind of where the weapons come from. Getting back to Greg's question a little bit. But you've started to see some degree of, I think, in part because the U.S. is stretched across multiple regions and it's increasingly worried about China, and kind of increasing willingness to kind of set aside these concerns that about allies becoming more independent, loosening their dependence on the U.S. As the threat environment, especially in East Asia, has gotten more severe from the U.S. perspective, and as U.S. resources are increasingly kind of deployed across multiple theaters all at once.
Thank you.
So with China and Russia's increasing investment in Africa, and seeing the U.S. Emerge with a new strategic alliance with Kenya, how do you think the U.S. will approach burden sharing as it relates to Russia and China and more of their economic relation to Africa?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's. I don't in the book I don't cover economic burden sharing as much, and so my comments just in general in my work. So I think my comments here are much more speculative. But in terms of the U.S. approach to kind of economic competition, to a large extent the U.S. approach to competition in Africa and really elsewhere too, has often not been economic at all, right? Like, the U.S., I'll take the case of Africa in particular, since it's a case I know to some extent. The U.S. interest in Africa for the last 20 years or so has largely been seen through the prism of bases. And that's declined a little bit over the last 5 years or so. But during the kind of peak years of the war on terror. The U.S. presence in Africa just exploded, and that was often accompanied by foreign aid packages, and in some cases like outright paying rent on these bases. That most notably in the case of Djibouti, which is this small country right on the Red Sea by the Horn of Africa, which hosts a U.S. base, a Chinese base, hosted a French base, might still. I believe it hosts a German and a Japanese base, which it's hot real estate, and but that's just the most extreme case. The U.S. has these little bases have popped up all around Africa. It's starting to contract a bit as the U.S. is kind of pivoting more toward Europe and East Asia a bit more. But I mean, the U.S. has really kind of been to some extent behind the game when it comes to economic competition, right? It's the U.S. has largely approached these relationships in a kind of through a military lens, more so than an economic lens. And it hasn't nearly had the kind of concerted economic strategy that China has through Belt and Road, or even Russia to some extent, to a lesser extent. And it's not just Africa where this has been the case. It's also the case in East Asia as well. One of the criticisms that U.S. policy toward Asia has gotten over the last 10 years is that it's not offering the region like an economic alternative to China, right? If it wants to compete with China, it has to actually compete with China. It has to, it hasn't joined what was the TPP before, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was involved in creating, and it just hasn't been an economic player, and in part because of domestic politics, right? There's been kind of a turn against trade in the U.S. that you've just recently seen with the Biden administration shooting down or looking like it will shoot down a Nippon Steel's acquisition of U.S. Steel, which if your goal is to kind of build up economic relations with friends, it sort of seems like the sort of thing that is kind of strange to do, and so the U.S. has, at least by my estimation, and others whose opinions I value, really kind of fallen behind. That's kind of the one area where the U.S. doesn't really seem like it's in the game.
Thank you, Brian. I have a question that amounts to a bit of a follow-up to the previous question concerning Japan. I can see the logic of your reasoning about the potential shift or the actual shift, very visible one in terms of threat environment, comparing the immediate aftermath of the end of the Cold War, when China had no reason yet, with today's threat environment for Japan. So that makes quite a bit of sense in light of your argument that if it could tolerate Japanese efforts to sort of strengthen its own military capabilities. The question that I'm wondering about is whether your argument can explain the variation in in U.S. tolerance towards Japanese rearmament in the two periods in which there was a serious threat environment because of the presence of a peer competitor. Peer competitor was in both cases located near Japan. I'm asking about comparing the Cold War with the current environment and what explains the variation in U.S. tolerance over Japan. I'm curious about whether your argument has kind of explanatory power there, or whether some other factors might be brought in. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll cut this a couple different ways. One, I mean, to your last remark there about other factors. I think the one, with Japan, the elephant in the room is kind of the post-war kind of culture of anti-militarism, right? Which is to some extent true for Germany as well. Though, that's much more of a kind of post-Cold War phenomenon for Germany, in part because the threat environment got better. Whereas in the case of Japan, it really is kind of baked into the foundation, literally into the foundation of the Constitution. And so, like the elephant in the room with Japan is that the evolution in Japanese security policy has happened very, very gradually. And it hasn't been, I think for that reason, hasn't necessarily been as reactive to changes in the threat environment or to changes in kind of perceived U.S. commitment as you might have expected to see from a country that didn't have kind of Japan's, culture of anti-militarism, and constitutional constraints, in some ways more importantly. And so, for that reason, its change has occurred much more gradually. But to the broader question of whether the argument can explain, I think you asked to kind of compare the Cold War to kind of more like the last 10 years, where you have kind of two periods where you have a similar security environment. I think that they can to some extent. I mean, I think that the threat environment during the peak of the Cold War and today is different in the important respect that during the Cold War, Japan, up until like the 1980s, Japan really wasn't all that worried about threats to its territorial integrity. In part because the Soviet Navy, the Soviet kind of amphibious capabilities in the kind of Western Pacific were not that potent. They just weren't that substantial up until like the 1980s. So at that point, Japan did start to worry, and that's when you did start to see some of the earlier signs of changes in Japanese security policy. You had the change in Japan took on more responsibility for the defense of the region around Japan. I think it was went from it was a couple hundred nautical miles to 1,000 nautical miles from Japan's shores, and the Cold War ends and things kind of you sort of hit the pause button. And I think today, the reason you're seeing today a kind of change in Japanese defense policy, especially over the last few years or so, is a kind of feeling of acute vulnerability. Because in some sense, China is much more capable today and anticipated to become more capable in the near future than the Soviet Union ever was in that region, right? Not so much the Soviets in Europe, but a combination of rising Chinese capabilities, and in particular, kind of concern about both Taiwan and also the Japanese Southwest Islands, even up to Okinawa, coupled with kind of the invasion of Ukraine, really, I think for a lot of folks in Japan, kind of shattering their perception of the international environment, kind of being a rude wake-up call about what might happen in Asia as well. I think it's a combination of those two factors, I think, that in some ways makes the threat environment in East Asia today more severe from Japan's perspective than it was during the Cold War. For South Korea, it's a little bit different. South Korea, relative to North Korea today, is much stronger than it was during the Cold War. But the broader changes around South Korea matter a lot too. I was in Seoul in March, and what a lot of folks told me is we're not so much concerned about China per se. We're concerned about the U.S. getting distracted by China and North Korea taking advantage of that, right? So it's very much they're not less concerned about China than Japan is per se, but China has an effect beyond just its beyond just its kind of what it threatens immediately from the perspective of folks in the region.
So thank you very much. I will confess I'm not in the field of political science. But I do have a question about your, just in general, just out of interest, your cover and your title. I'm a classicist, so Sisyphus. So I thought it was very interesting that you prefaced your entire talk speaking about the pessimistic perspective on making alliances. So I was wondering why you chose Sisyphus as a front image, if that was maybe to channel that pessimism and you're going to reverse that. And then the second question I had was with the word coercive. I tend to do research on coercion and persuasion in antiquity. So I'm interested in your use of the word coercive diplomacy when and kind of the way that it relates to the word constraint that you used frequently throughout the presentation. Because I was wondering, like, the constraints of diplomacy, constrained diplomacy, or my question is, are all diplomatic attempts to make alliances by the United States actually coercive? Or are there just a lot of constraints around it? And I don't mean you to have an existential crisis about your title or your book or anything like that, but those are the questions that came up for me, and I wonder if you had some thoughts.
Yeah. So I think these are, this forces me to kind of reconstruct some of my thought processes. But yeah, I mean, I guess I'll try to take those in order. On the cover in particular, yeah. So the I wanted to kind of channel like the Sisyphean dilemma, which is to say, you can roll this thing up the hill, but you won't ever quite get there.
Yeah.
And to kind of channel that, to some extent, that's kind of how I feel about the burden sharing issue, right? You can kind of try to get there, but either you won't get there, and then that's a problem for you, or you do get there and it's maybe you're too successful for your own good. So that was part of the thought process behind the cover. Admittedly, the idea of Sisyphus was mine. The whole design of the cover was just completely, the press just kind of dumped that on me.
As per usual.
I gave them Sisyphus, and they gave me what I was ultimately pretty happy with.
Yeah.
So I really like the way it turned out. But yeah, it was the Sisyphus idea was mine, but the implementation was totally theirs. On the title, yeah. So on the issue of coercion versus constraint. I hadn't really thought much about that. I mean, to some extent, I think about them as being sort of two different links in the causal chain to some extent. Like the constraint, the coercion is the practice, and the constraint is sort of the thing that leads you to coercion to some extent, right? You sort of I think the U.S. often, and I think the term coercive in the type, in the discussion around burden sharing. I mean, I think it's not always necessarily coercive. I mean, part of the what I didn't get to in the talk is that part of what makes testing this argument and kind of burden sharing in general is that allies are themselves like very strategic actors, right? Like they're anticipating what the U.S. might be willing and able to do, and they kind of will tailor their behavior in anticipation of the possibility of being coerced, right? And so oftentimes measuring coercion. This is why this is way more background than you asked for, but this is why kind of measuring and observing attempts at coercion is often quite difficult, because these things often happen, one, behind the scenes, and two, they often just don't happen at all because the ally doesn't necessarily even have to be directly coerced to kind of feel the possibility of coercion kind of in the air, which makes studying it hard. That was one of the biggest challenges in actually digging into the documents to try and find this stuff. You often don't observe it in reality.
Thank you.
Well, I think with that lovely sort of cross-disciplinary intervention, it seems like a nice sort of high note to close our evening on. So please join me in thanking Brian. But before we do that, Brian is poised and ready to sign copies of his book. He's got a Sharpie at the ready. There are additional copies of Brian's book available for purchase at the desk over there. So please do that. And but before you do that, please join me in giving Brian a round of applause for a really kind of interesting talk.